In this Star Trek ranking video, I will be ranking the current 18 different Star Trek Starfleet uniform iterations from worst to best. Keep in mind I will not be including any uniforms from the Kelvin timeline as always, and though I get the complaints raised about New Trek, I will be including uniforms from New Trek, as I do believe they try their best to remain part of the Prime timeline. Note that I will not be including any variant uniforms, such as cold weather uniforms, warm weather uniforms, dress uniforms, or admiral uniforms, though I will mention briefly some of the admiral uniforms where I deem it necessary. I will not be ranking the separate colors to each uniform, but instead the uniform style as a whole, though I may make mentions of the colors I like best. Number 18. Discovery Seasons 3 to 4 uniforms. The 32nd century uniforms are ugly in every way. From the bland gray overall design to the vomit color stripes that vertically clash with the dull parts of the uniform, I despise these uniforms. I can't think of one positive to describe them. For being the second most advanced uniforms in the Star Trek universe in terms of chronology, these are a massive step backwards. The shoulder straps are weird for sure, and I just don't get the vertical splash of color that contrasts the mute, boring uniform. Not sure what I hate more, how colorless the uniforms are, or how bright the stripes are. The collar looks odd with an arrow shape on it, and it just looks terrible. The Starfleet badge here is an uncharacteristically revolting design as well. There's nothing sleek, stylish, or reminiscent of a typical cutting-edge Starfleet uniform with these. Thank goodness Discovery changed these, at least rectifying these abysmal uniforms. This was one small slip from the tailor's knife that resulted in a giant quantum-level leap backwards for Starfleet. Number 17. The motion picture uniforms. Worn in the mid-2270s, these uniforms are the first redesigns of a Star Trek uniform release date-wise after the original series. Unfortunately, they look awful, with muted dull colors that greatly collide with the previous TOS bright and colorful iterations. These uniforms are a very sorry attempt at advancement. Most disappointing of all, perhaps, is like the previous uniform on this list, they again sport weird shoulder straps. I hate these weird shoulder straps on a uniform. They look pointless, impractical, and uncomfortable. The life support belts that are only worn exclusively on this iteration of a Starfleet uniform are an awkward-looking stylistic choice. Speaking of awkward-looking stylistic choices, these uniforms were also incredibly tight on those who wore them. Coming in dull beige, gray, and white, these uniforms don't stand out but blend into the backgrounds of ships. Nothing stands out about them as being good. They look like pajamas or undergarments, being that they are onesies, and even then, they don't appear to be very stylish nightwear at all. Perhaps even being dull being worn as pajamas. The only positives about these uniforms is how great Kirk looks in the dual-colored white and gray Rear Admiral's uniform. But while this classy look makes him stand out, the standard uniforms for everyone else blend into the walls and floor of the ship. Perhaps the bland colors worked as camouflage for the crew members, since none of them wearing these jumped off the screen. The golden Starfleet badge that accompanied this uniform is overall pretty nice, but overall, these look like the worst pajamas money could buy. Number 16. Discovery Season 4 and presumably Season 5 uniforms. These uniforms began service in the year 3190. While these uniforms at the very least rectified the chronologically previous disgusting all-gray uniforms with splash stripes of color, they still don't do much. They are basically the same design as the all-gray uniforms, with a weird Starfleet badge, odd shoulder straps, and a weird arrow on the collar. But at least these have more color, sporting lovely bright reds, yellows, and blues instead of the gray. I don't love the white design for the medical officers, though. I think they're quite plain, and I like uniformity in my uniforms. Therefore, the medical branch being so different aggravates me. However, I do like the overall bright, solid colors that make up the uniform, that are at least a step over the previous 32nd century disaster. The black stripe vertically slashing through these uniforms, however, is still a concept which I dislike. These are better than the previous uniforms, but still a long way from a good uniform. I just think the weird stripe from the shoulder downwards looks odd on a Starfleet uniform. Number 15. TOS early uniforms. These uniforms were used in the first 4 episodes of the original series, and therefore have the honor of being the first uniforms in Star Trek history, and are dated in-universe at being in service for Starfleet from the years 2254 to 2268. Unfortunately, these uniforms were used in episodes early in the show's production, and so they had not yet found their footing. Instead of the iconic, multicolored uniforms that made the TOS uniforms so vibrant and fun, the early uniforms were all a yellowish-green color that appeared like a muddy, dull yellow. There's nothing overly egregious about these designs, just nothing eye-catching about them. The dull, solid color had a uniformity, since practically the whole crew was in one color, which is something I do usually like in a uniform, just not in a ugly yellow. But they were dull, and lacked a black collar that made the later TOS uniforms really dignified. The uniform and collar being the same color as the uniform made the uniform appear as a regular and pretty tacky sweater. It had an extremely informal manner to it as well, that made it feel un-uniform-like. Overall, I'm so glad that TOS didn't use these for the whole run of the show, because they're not the best. Number 14, Voyager Future Uniforms. These uniforms appeared in several episodes of Voyager depicting future Starfleet from the 29th century. These uniforms aren't terrible, but at the same time they are certainly not my favorite either. They look sort of Romulan in design, with the textured shoulder patches reminding me of Romulan uniforms. The patterning on the shoulders seemingly could be gray, blue, or a bronzish brown, but it is the patterning on this colored section that appears Romulan to me. Aside from that, they aren't too distinctive in design from the template for uniforms set by TNG and DS9 era uniforms. They are similarly styled, but just dull and colorless, with grays and blacks dominating this design. Therefore, they just feel a little lifeless. They aren't terrible. I do like the Starfleet Delta badge being flipped sideways. That gives it a sort of interesting futuristic look. But I do think that they are just overall a little bland. So overall, not a bad uniform, just not great. Just sort of there as a Starfleet uniform iteration that existed. Not too bad, just too gray to bring too much pizzazz to the table. Number 13. TNG Seasons 1 to 2 uniforms. These spandex onesies may at a glance appear to be the same as the incredible and iconic uniforms donned by the next-gen crew in the majority of the seasons of TNG. But I assure you that these early uniform iterations are nowhere near the glory of the eventual TNG look. These uniforms were the late 2350s uniforms, being decommissioned in approximately 2366 in exchange for the much better uniforms that would follow. These uniforms' most obvious glaring feature that differentiates them from further next-gen uniforms is the weird stripe of color in the top black patch of these uniforms. It makes them look sort of uncomfortable to me. Them being tight-fitting spandex onesies make them slightly duller colors on the uniform itself. But on top of this, with how tight these uniforms were, I would think that it would make the little color stripes dig into you if you were wearing them, I'd imagine. Which is why those lines of color appear uncomfortable to me around the shoulders. These aren't bad uniforms. They're very much like the next-gen uniforms that I really love. However, these small little details make them kind of meh. I just find I don't like them very much. They aren't awful, they just aren't good enough. They did set the template for one of my favorite uniforms in Starfleet, but all of these little issues with them just highlight how bland and mediocre they are. Number 12, Picard-era uniforms. These uniforms were worn in the 2390s and are very reminiscent of the DS9 and Voyager uniforms, with the mostly black uniform design with color blocks across the top. The main difference I notice with them is the replacing of the purplish undershirt in exchange for a black undershirt. They also have flaps on the front of the uniform, similar to the motion picture uniforms and lower decks uniforms. The flaps have a colored line going across them, and on the colored section at the top have a black line across them that show the line of the flap. I'm not huge on the Starfleet badge of this era, but overall, I do find these uniforms to be aesthetically pleasing. They're reminiscent of a happier age of Trek, with a similar design to the DS9 early years uniforms. I like the flaps, it gives it a nice look. I just wish there wasn't a black line across the flap on the top colored section. I am also not a fan of the mini delta symbol patterning across the colored section. It gives a textured look that I don't love, as it reminds me of the Kelvin timeline uniforms. These uniforms are overall pretty nice, but there are still more cons than pros to this uniform in my opinion. Number 11. Star Trek motion picture uniforms. These uniforms thankfully replaced the horrible uniforms from the motion picture, and debuted in The Wrath of Khan, and continue to be used throughout the rest of the TMPs. These uniforms were in service for the longest in Starfleet history, sprawling from the 2270s to the 2350s. I like many aspects of these uniforms. The gold Starfleet Delta looks really good with the deep red uniforms. The white cuffs and collar make the overall look pretty classy. I also think the black belt, boots, and pants altogether provide a unified contrast for the solid colored shirt. This uniform is colorful enough, has a nice unified feel, and is overall a pretty solid uniform. The solid Trek films in which these uniforms are worn give me good feelings whenever I see them, because I correlate the uniforms in my mind to the films that I enjoy. While these uniforms are not the best uniforms Starfleet has to offer, I do think they are a really solid addition to the Star Trek uniforms lineup. Number 10. Prodigy uniforms. These uniforms are very reminiscent of the TNG uniforms of the 2360s and 2370s. Being worn by 2384, these uniforms are nice and colorful, which I enjoy. There's some differences, a main one being that these uniforms have a flap on them. The flap is marked by a sleek silver line, which I think looks really nice. Unlike those TNG uniforms, they don't have the black, blocky triangle that cuts up into the solid bright colors. Instead, they only have black pants, with the whole shirt being one of the bright colors. One small nitpick is I don't like the Starfleet badge very much on these uniforms. These uniforms are overall really nice though, and harken back to a classic era of Trek. They're vibrant and fun, but I do prefer the very similarly designed iteration that chronologically comes one spot before these from Lower Decks. Overall though, a really solid uniform. Number 9. Strange New Worlds uniforms. These uniforms were in service chronologically one spot before the TOS uniforms, and appear in Discovery and Strange New Worlds. These are really brightly colored uniforms, with different colors denoting the divisions, and extremely large black collars that wrap around the neck. Rank is noted by armbands on the sleeves. I think these uniforms are super snazzy, but something about the thick black collar just isn't as sleek as the TOS design that is incredibly similar to these. The patterning on the shoulders and sides around the hips is also a minor detractor for me. But overall, the nostalgic and vibrant feel of these super upbeat uniforms make me immediately smile upon seeing them. They are really nice and are a great callback to the original series uniforms. Number 8. Discovery Seasons 1 to 2 uniforms. The uniforms in Discovery Seasons 1 and 2 are certainly an interesting and distinctive uniform in Starfleet's history. If I had to pick which uniform stands out the most, I would say it's these ones. I do really like them as well. These uniforms are also a pretty good progression continuity-wise from the same colored blue uniforms from the Enterprise show. The one thing that sets these back from being top 5 for me is that some of the uniforms are gold for command, silver for science, or bronze for operation. I would have rathered a consistent metal pattern on these uniforms, and I do really like the look of the silver with the blue, so I would have gone with just that one and not the bronze or copper denoting different divisions. Overall, I think the shape of these uniforms is stylish, the color and look is classy, and is a natural progression from the Enterprise-era uniforms. The Starfleet Delta badge here is really nice too, personally one of my favorite ones. I like how it still has that jumpsuit feel from the Enterprise-era uniforms. Overall, despite the show's obvious glaring faults, the uniforms are really a nice addition to Trek. Number 7. Lower Decks uniforms. Used in the animated series Lower Decks, these uniforms were worn in the early 2380s, and were replaced by the slightly different Prodigy uniforms. These uniforms are likewise a callback to TNG-era uniforms, and are a absolutely terrific design that I really do love. These uniforms are super sharp, yet pretty straightforward in design, with solid colored uniforms that are black at the top with a flap marked with a colored line. I really love the white-silver outline that separates the black from the color on these uniforms. I really think that looks sharp and adds a nice distinctive level of class. The Starfleet badges here are really nice, reminiscent of the TOS patches and scaled back in design. I like the fact that the boots on these uniforms have a stripe of a little splash of color on the top of the boots, which is nice, because most uniforms, the pants and boots, are one solid color. So this is a nice addition. Say what you will about Lower Deck's negative effects on Trek, but overall I think the uniforms are absolutely perfect. Really, really sharp. Number 6. TOS uniforms. These uniforms are arguably the most iconic Star Trek uniforms of all. While not the very first uniforms ever, they are the ones immediately recognizable in pop culture for almost 60 years. Yes, they are somewhat simplistic, but they are also timeless. The fact that they have held up after so long and still look good as uniforms is a testament to how visionary these uniforms were and are. The fact that in the 1960s, they made what they perceived to be as futuristic clothing, and that 60 years later, it still looks like a possibility, really goes to show how brilliant and elegant these simple designs are. Sporting the rank symbols on the sleeves, black pants and black boots, solid-colored sweater-like uniforms with a Starfleet Delta patch, as well as a black undershirt that can be seen around the collar, these uniforms are certainly one of the simplest in design. Yet it still seems futuristic enough to serve the purpose the uniform was intended to. I love the bright colors that pop off of the bridge with these uniforms. However, one thing I do like in my very favorite uniforms is a unity in uniform design. So the different colors are perhaps all that stops the TOS uniforms from claiming a top 3 spot. These uniforms remain classy all this time later, and I just am frankly unable to express just how incredible these beautiful, timeless uniforms are. Absolutely fantastic. Number 5. DS9 Wartime Uniforms. These uniforms were worn by Starfleet as a sort of wartime uniform, to reflect the seriousness of the Dominion War. They were introduced in the last seasons of DS9, and were even donned by the TNG crew in the later films in the series. These uniforms reflected a more serious and somber era in Starfleet's history, managing to be incredibly classy, yet highlighting the grave situation that Starfleet faced. Temporarily removing the bright, upbeat colors that had defined Starfleet uniforms for centuries, I believe these uniforms reflected the 2370s and 2380s wartime shift away from focus on space exploration for Starfleet. With a shift away from exploration towards full focus on self-preservation in a deadly war, a shift away from the happier colors was temporarily the decision for these uniforms. These uniforms were much the same in style as the early DS9 uniforms, but replaced a splash of color across the top with a bleak gray material. In certain light, it appears sort of bluish. The only color on these uniforms are the solid color by division undershirts that go up their necks, and a little cut of material down the chest showcases that tiny burst of color. While these may be a tad dull for some tastes, overall I think these uniforms are super sleek and stylish. Narratively, these uniforms are also a great fit for the time period they are worn in. Number 4. Picard Early Uniforms. These uniforms are really, really nice and were worn in the mid-2380s in the early seasons of Star Trek Picard. I think these uniforms are incredibly snazzy and are reminiscent of early DS9 uniforms with the same mostly black design, but they had a few adjustments here that really make them pop. Firstly, I absolutely love the diagonal slash of color on the wrists of these uniforms. It really adds an awesome layer to the uniforms, I think. The small black line through the color at the top of the uniforms gives it a distinctive and a very nice design as well. I really, really like these uniforms and wish we had gotten to see them in use for longer. I really love the Admiral's uniform specifically, which sports an additional silver stripe on the shoulders. These were designed really, really well, and are fantastic and vibrant yet professional looking uniforms. Number 3. Voyager/DS9 Early Uniforms. Originally introduced in TNG as cadet uniforms, before becoming uniforms for space stations, and eventually making their way onto starships, these uniforms are absolutely brilliant. The uniform black design to these uniforms, with a splash of color across the shoulders and a purple undershirt that sticks out of the uniform at the wrists and around the neck, these uniforms are dignified and sleek, with just enough color to stay interesting and a black design that makes the uniforms uniform. I really do think these uniforms are pretty awesome. They have a professional feel that makes them feel at place in a banquet, yet also feeling like they would be perfect to do some gritty hands-on work. These uniforms feel perfect for many different occasions. Classy, elegant, yet practical, these uniforms are incredibly versatile and convey a balanced, gritty edge with a vibrant, upbeat spirit. Number 2, next-gen uniforms for the later seasons. The next generation uniforms feel really iconic and also make me feel nostalgic. TNG did the impossible, established itself as a legitimate, beloved show, able to stand on its own feet separate from the beloved and timeless classic TOS. TNG somehow managed to continue on the spirit that makes TOS so iconic, and change and tweak it in the right places to etch out a place in pop culture for itself that is every bit as iconic as that original series. A large part of it has to do with the amazing uniforms that TNG had. While the first 2 season uniforms were not the best in my opinion, they did lay the ground for an incredible template going forward. Worn through 5 seasons of TNG, these 2-piece uniforms replaced the tight-fitting and somewhat faded spandex uniforms that were the first 2 seasons of TNG outfits. These uniforms were a mix of solid color and black color throughout the uniform, with sharp edges on the black colors and sharp angles that gave it a sleek feel. The colors are so vibrant and fun, and perfectly represent that exciting feeling of space exploration. These uniforms are arguably, at this point, more iconic even than the TOS uniforms, managing to establish themselves firmly in pop culture. These uniforms are vibrant, fun, and full of life, and only one uniform is able to beat it for me. Number 1, Enterprise uniforms. The first chronological uniforms are a marked difference from many of the other uniforms in Star Trek, but boy oh boy, how wonderful they are. I absolutely love the whole vibe to these uniforms. Basically a one-piece overall with tons of zipper pockets and a blue color with small stripes of color to denote division on the shoulders. These uniforms are very distinctive from any others. Being the first chronologically, they were designed as a sort of combination and cross between NASA astronaut uniforms and Starfleet uniforms, as chronologically this is where they would take place. This is part of the reason I love them so much. Narratively, they are just a perfect fit. My favorite of these is definitely the Command Gold uniforms, as the yellow stripes on the shoulders contrast the blue so nicely. I love the shoulder patch that is reminiscent of a NASA patch too. These uniforms honestly feel the most functional for exploration, as they are flame-resistant in material, have tons of pockets for gear, and are able to be moved around in freely. They can provide insulation and are perfect for getting your hands dirty. You'd have a hard time finding a place these uniforms wouldn't fit. Whether exploring a forest, cave, Arctic tundra, working in a garage on an engine, or at a professional banquet, these uniforms will be perfect for anywhere. Balancing function with class, these uniforms are snazzy and cutting edge enough to be eye-catching, whilst prioritizing a feeling of being perfect for working. I love these uniforms, and would love to buy one to wear myself. I know my number 1 is probably a controversial pick, but overall, how was my list? Did you agree? Disagree? Let me know what your ranking is of the Star Trek Starfleet uniforms, or let me know your thoughts on my ranking in the comments.